Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to another job retrospective video. You know, I started this project at the beginning of the year to celebrate 10 years of A Realm Reborn, and now it's November, and we're finally coming to what I at least plan to be the final job retrospective video. I feel like anything after Heavensward is a little bit too modernized to really point out too many things. Besides, it's just going to lead to a samurai video where I point out how at one point you had Kaiten, and now you don't. So I don't think that's worth an entire 40 to 50 minute analysis of those jobs and onward. That being said, this video is on none other than Astrologian, the one remaining Heavensward job I had to make a retrospective of, and one of two jobs I thought I had already made a video about. So thank you to my comment section for constantly pestering me about it, because otherwise I probably would have continued to forget. But we're going to be looking at the history of this very divisive job from its release in Heavensward to its current state. And keep in mind, we have to kind of revisit that in the next expansion, as we know for a fact the job is getting a rework in Dawntrail. So I probably won't lament on that too much in this video. Let's just lament on what once was and how people feel about it now. So in order to do a proper retrospective, we need to pull up all of the old job skills. For that, I use the Wayback Machine. I just pull up a bunch of different dates from a bunch of various sites, and we just read through the skills and what they are, compare them at the start of the expansion and at the end, and then move on to the next one. So we're using the console games wiki right now to look back at on launch Astrologian. And let me tell you, this job was not good. Dookie was the word I was going to use, but I was like, maybe I don't say that. No, that's what it was. It was pretty dookie when it first came out. In fact, all the Heavensward jobs kind of came with an initial stigma against them. Even Dark Knight, which ended up performing quite well. But Astro was kind of a mess. So because Astra was coming into a game where there was one pure healer and one barrier healer, and they wanted it to fit in any raid composition, it functioned in such a way that it was balanced to be in between. It could function in either of the two roles, but it had to be balanced against its more supportive features for the rest of the team. This led to it being drastically underpowered in almost every single way when it was released. Its healing potencies were too low, its shields were too weak, and its supportive effects were not enough to really offset that. So it was kind of rare to see one included in raid teams, at least for the first few months, before they started really amping things up. And while I'm only going to be looking at the beginning of Heavensward and the end, I can promise you it went through many transformations along the way. In the middle of that take, I could hear Ivy. She's not pleased that I'm recording this at 9 p.m. Daylight saving just happened, so she thinks it's bedtime. Isn't that right, Ivy? No, you're drooling everywhere. Well, we have Astro to talk about first, so let's take a look. So here we have on Heavensward release Astrologian, and the big thing to look at is going to be the cure potencies, because otherwise a lot of these skills are quite familiar, but the ones that aren't, I actually do miss to some capacity. You have Malefic, you have Benefic, you have Combust, you have Light Speed, which reduced the cast time for spells by 2.5 seconds while reducing magic potency by 50%. Yeah, they didn't want people using Light Speed for DPS, so they made sure that while you had it up, your damage was cut in half. Yeah, that was not a very popular opinion, and as you can see, not a decision that survived throughout the ages. One thing that actually kind of surprises me, I forgot their equivalent of, I think it was Shroud of Saints back in Heavensward, was called Luminiferous Ether, reduced enmity generation and gave the refresh effect. I just forgot that that was even called that. You have Helios, the basic AoE heal. Remember, look at those potencies. You have 380 on Benefic, you have 290 on Helios, and these are several points lower than what White Mage and Scholar were rocking at the time. Ascend, you have Essential Dignity, which scaled up to 1,000 potency at lower HP. Actually was a pretty popular skill even on release, especially because healers were constantly bouncing back and forth between trying to heal and deal DPS. So having that thing that they could swap out of Cleric stance with and instantly pop a big heal on was very popular. You have their Asuna equivalent with Exalted Detriment. You have Stella, which I completely forgot about. Does that have a cast time? Range, radius, cast time? Yeah, 2.5 seconds to deal unaspected damage. Yeah, that was just like a heavy equivalent. I think that's because Stone had a heavy on it, so they gave Astro some sort of heavy cast equivalent. I mean, both of the other healers had some sort of heavy equivalent, but yeah, that was what Stella was. Benefit 2, potency of 620. And then, of course, we get to the cards. Now, a lot of this is going to seem familiar, but a lot of it's going to seem very foreign. You draw a card from your deck, you hold on to it for 15 seconds, and the recast timer cooldown will begin once the drawn card is read. I can hear Ivy still complaining. Or the draw timer expires. So when you drew a card, you only had 15 seconds to decide what you were going to do with it, but you had a lot more options to decide what to do with it. Then we get into the sect. So you had diurnal sect and nocturnal sect. So this was how they decided to divide the job between being either a barrier healer or a regen healer. Diurnal sect was essentially their regen effect. They got a 5% haste, so all their spells cast faster. They had a lower GCD, and certain effects, the aspected effects, were given a regen effect. Whereas Nocturnal increased their healing potency and put shields on their various spells. But we'll get to that in a second. Now we come down to Aspected Benefic, which works not too dissimilar. Most of these skills work similar to the way they work in Diurnal now, so that's the comparable thing. So, you know, it just had some HP, a potency of 190, while under Nocturnal, it had a higher potency, on top of Nocturnal just having a higher potency, you know, the buff on top of that. And for Diurnal, it had a 100-point regen for 6 ticks for 18 seconds. And then you can see here also with Nocturnal, it erected a magic barrier, which nullified damage equaling the amount of HP restored. Now, that is the key bit, because that meant 100% of the healing was a shield, but that was not enough. To put it lightly, that did not nearly do enough for the job in terms of shielding. So that's something you're going to see change going into the end of Heavensward. Then you have the classic card effects. Royal Road. The old heads definitely missed this one. Basically, you could take your drawn card and return it to the deck in exchange for enhancing the next card that you drew. If you return the Bowl or the Balance, you got a 150% potency buff, so it would be 50% more potent your next card. Arrow and the Spear made the potency 50% of what it would normally be, but became AoE, and You Were Inspired doubled the duration of it. Now, even this is a great deal different than what it would be. I can hear Ivy. She's getting the zoomies right as I started recording. I'm not going to lie. I'd kind of forgotten that You Were Inspired had double duration, because at some point, I think they become the AoE cards. So I'm going to have to see that, because definitely interested to see the evolution of Royal Road. Then you have Disable, which is a really interesting skill Astro used to have. So it reduced the potency of the target's next action. Only the next action with a duration of 10 seconds. So you had to time it basically during a cast bar in order to make sure it didn't get eaten by some other random attack or skill. It was very awkward to use, and another thing that would go through a change before the end of Heavensward. Then you have the Spread effect. This is just the ability to hold a card indefinitely so you could save it for a later time. Something that, you know, you're not too unfamiliar with from recent expansions, but that was, you know, on release. Then you have Aspected Helios, just, you know, their Medica equivalent. 140 cure potency. When under Diurnal, it had the regen effect on it for 30 seconds. And for Nocturnal, it would erect a barrier as well. Again, be sure to look at the changes for that. Shuffle was just, you know, shuffle the card you have back into the deck and pull a new one, and you hope that it was the one that you actually wanted. Combust 2, which, if I recall back in Heavensward, Combust 1 and Combust 2 were actually two different skills still. You know, we had, you know, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 on White Mage. They were stacking 3 dots. I'm pretty sure Combust and Combust 2 were both that way. And I think Combust 2, yeah, Combust 2 also had an actual cast time to it. Then you get to Nocturnal Sect, increased healing magic potency by 5% while adding the barrier effect. We already talked about that earlier, but that was how it worked in opposition to Diurnal Sect. Then you had Sinistry. Sinistry was a skill that was never loved. Just because of the way that the game was designed, it had so few applications. Basically, it's kind of like a healing beacon from WoW. Generate an etheric bond with a target party member. Each time you cast a healing spell on a party member not under the effect of Sinistry, the party member with Sinistry would recover HP equaling 50% of the original spell. Big thing with this is you needed to cast single target spells. So, that was something that people had already kind of abandoned, or whenever you did need to do it, it was a very fringe case. So Sinistry definitely more useful at this point, because I'd say there was a decent bit more single target healing, especially in high-end progression rating, where tanks were tanking without tank stance, and tank stance was actually part of your average mitigation. So it's all more use, but it was something that definitely got phased out a little bit quick, and now Aloha is trying to get up here. They're both so upset about daylight saving. Gravity, pretty much the same it is now. I mean, the potencies have changed and everything, and it had a 3-second cast time back then. But otherwise, it's still their AoE ability. You have Malefic 2 here as well. You have Time Dilation, which is a skill I kind of want to return, even though it doesn't really make sense to return with the way the job works now. I just really like that kind of time mage aesthetic that the job had back then, and honestly has gone back to a little bit with Horoscope and Earthly Star, all these timed abilities that they have now. It extended the duration of the target's beneficial effects by 15 seconds, and there were a lot of applications for this. For example, if you put the bowl on a tank, which back then the bowl card was damage mitigation, and then you'd throw maybe some regens on them, you had a bunch of different skills that could apply a regen as a diurnal sect Astrologian, you could just give them like a super chunky heal over time / mitigation effect while they do a super big pull in a dungeon. And it's those kind of interactions that people miss with Astrologian. While you often hear people like myself talk about how it was pull the balance or bust, that wasn't really the case yet, because the cards were not ultra strong at this point, so you really weren't hard fishing for a balance. Was it still probably the most sought after card? Sure, but it didn't have as much of an advantage yet at this point, so things like that were a little more normal at the start of Heavensward. Just didn't make up for the job's overall strength. Then we get to Collective Unconscious, which had 2 different effects depending on your sect. If you were in Diurnal, it gave everyone in range a regen. And if you were Nocturnal, it gave you the damage reduction. You had to choose between the two. And Nocturnal was not very popular at the start, so it was essentially just a 90-second recast regen for people who are nearby. Not super exciting. Then Celestial Opposition was an AoE stun that also extended the duration of beneficial effects by 5 seconds. So again, you could use that alongside Time Dilation and get even more time. And plus, the stun on monsters and dungeons was still useful, even if it wasn't as strong as Holy, because Holy did all of it in a single spell. Then we get on to the cards, and they all had different effects when they initially released. You had the Balance, which increased the target's damage dealt by 10% for 15 seconds. The Bowl, which reduced their damage taken by 10%. The Arrow, which increased their attack speed by 10%, which was the biggest piece of grief, dude. People ran out of TP so much even without stuff like that. If you gave that to like a Monk or a Dark Knight, you were actively griefing them. So, not a very popular card. And you can see the Royal Road effects on the right-hand side as well. You have the Spear, reduce their target action recast time, non-GCD, by 20 seconds. Now, you know how strict 2-minute windows are now? They may not have been as strict back then, but essentially the Spear would cause your non-GCD abilities to just desync with everything else. Like, you still had a general flow of things that you wanted to maintain back then, and this just ruined it. So the Arrow and the Spear, both absolutely terrible griefing cards, and the Spear also only worked if you knew the person was going to be using those types of skills. So yeah, there's a reason those versions of the cards don't survive. The Ewer would reduce the MP cost of the target's spells, and the Spire would reduce the TP cost of weapon skills. Now, 4 out of 6 of these effects are going to change, and in fact, I'm pretty sure the Royal Road effects do change as well, but we'll get to that in a second. As for their traits, the magic decrease to light speed was only 25% after level 16. It still reduced your damage, which was, not great. Allowing to cast Raise in battle, Essential Dignities recast going down. The Benefic 2, this was their free cure equivalent. Instead of it being a free cure, like with White Mage, you cast Cure 1 and there's a chance your Cure 2 is free. Here, it's you cast Benefic 1 and there's a 15% chance your Benefic 2 would be instant cast. Yeah, again, not very good. Disables damage reduction being increased to 10%, and Luminiferous Ether having its refresh potency increased to 80. Now, that largely does it. I mean, we could briefly talk about the cross-class stuff, but I mean, this I've beaten the heck in the Retrospect series, so I don't think we need to. Now, let's go to the end of Heavensward, where things are drastically different. In fact, I should scroll back up here because I want you to see some of the numbers. So, for example, look at Benefic's curing potency of 380. Goes up to 400 here. You're not going to see much in the way of their DPS spells change, but then you even just have light speed, which has a completely different effect. Well, actually, it doesn't have a completely different effect. It has a whole new effect added on top of it. Reduce the MP cost of spells by 25%, and cast time for spells to 2.5 seconds while reducing magic potency. So it still reduced the magic potency at this point, but it added this reduced MP cost on top of it. Luminiferous Ether, still the same. Helios, 300. What was it here? It was 290. So kind of a small buff, but trust me, it'll be more noticeable in a second. Essential Dignity stayed the same. Most of the stuff stayed the same. Benefic 2, I think, jumped up from 620 to 650. It did, in fact, do that. And then we start getting into some of the other effects. So Draw, for example, lasting 30 seconds instead of 15 seconds is another change. And Diurnal Sect and Nocturnal Sect both getting a new effect. Also reduces Enmity generation. Yeah, Enmity was a big problem in Heavensward. But this really felt like, because of the way tanks were playing, and less because it was ultra necessary, but it helped an immense amount. Then we get into some of the more noticeable changes in that of Aspected Benefic. So the big thing that you'll notice here is the barrier. Now, I think the potencies, the base potencies in some things changed. In fact, I'm almost certain that the regen potency jumped up by 40 per tick. So that's a big one. But the big thing is, instead of 100% of the barrier, it was 170% of the amount of HP restored as a barrier. This made it much more in line. In fact, I think if I recall the math, a non-crit aspected benefic was better than a non-crit eloquium, but the crit eloquium was still better than the crit aspected benefic. So its average use case actually made it a little bit better, on top of being instant cast, even if the MP cost was pretty severe. Was definitely a more popular version of it. And that's going to get even more popular when you see some of the other changes that happen. Now, as we go over to Royal Road, you can see they swapped the effects here. Arrow and Spear became double duration, and Ewer and Spire became the AoE but half potency equivalent. Disable also became a totally different skill. Instead of just reducing the next action, it reduced all actions, but only for 6 seconds. So essentially the same use case, but instead of it being accidentally consumed, you just had to time it with the skill you were actually trying to mitigate. Fairly useful, very similar to Dismantle Now, but with a little bit tighter of a time window. And trust me, not something Astros would complain if they managed to get back in the current day. Spread is the same. Aspected Helios, I'm fairly certain, saw a bump in its base potency, but a reduction in its AoE potency. So it was 140 and 50 for Diurnal, and now it's 240. So giving it more of that initial bump, but less of that follow-up heal over time. Its potency while under Nocturnal, however, was not that much higher. It was 150, which is still a little higher than it was before. But the barrier was 50% stronger. It was 150% of the heal instead of just the 100%. So again, huge buff to its average use case. You have Redraw, you have Combust 2, and then you have Nocturnal Sect, which saw another significant buff. On top of getting the Enmity reduction, it had 10% healing potency instead of 5. So all these potency bumps that Nocturnal had gotten were also enhanced even further by the fact they had 5% more healing potency built in. So those shields, again, just saw such an improvement over the course of the expansion. And keep in mind, I guess I should talk about this. These changes were all gradual throughout the expansion, but the biggest upgrade coming up was definitely in 3.4, and I'm excited to talk about that one. Sinistry here as well. The big change that happened here was that it increased the caster's healing potency by 20% for 20 seconds. So even if you didn't really need the actual Sinistry effect, which got nerfed by 10%, it was 50% of the healing here. Now it's only 40%. You did get this 20% healing potency buff, which went a long way and made Sinistry just kind of useful as a whole. Gravity still mostly the same, Malefic the same, Time Dilation the same. Collective Unconscious saw a massive change, whereas at the start of Heavensward, its effect was determined by which sect you were in. They removed that and instead just gave it both effects at the same time. It granted a regen and a 10% damage reduction to any party member who entered. And this is pretty much how it survived up till today. By that iteration was pretty much decided on back then. And well, it's definitely seen some changes since. It's still definitely effective now. What was interesting is that the damage reduction duration was 18 seconds, but the effect duration of the actual bubble was 15. So they just made sure that they had that extra bit of time that you needed for the damage mitigation. And then Celestial Opposition also got buffed to 10 seconds instead of 5 seconds. Now, in patch 3.4, the job hit what was considered OP status. By 3.2, it was acceptable for that raid tier. It was not uncommon to see it, but it wasn't the only thing you saw. Definitely more common than it was, and I think a little more common than White Mage. By 3.4, it was a joke if you were bringing White Mages to actual endgame raids, and it's largely because of these changes to the cards. The balance, 20% at base. The bowl, 20% at base. The arrow, still attack speed, don't care. And the spear, 20% don't care, still absolutely toxic. But then the Ewer and the Spire refresh the target's MP. Instead of it reducing cost, it was just an actual refresh. And then the Spire TP, which was infinitely more usable than what they had before. But this is where the balance joke comes in. So before, it was 10%. So if you, let's say you royal roaded a bowl and had the 150% buff, you went from 10% to 15% of a damage increase. That's true of the bowl too, which was reduces target damage taken by 10%. Now, if you boosted it by 50%, you are looking at a 30% damage increase and a 30% damage reduction. 30%. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people fished for either the single target one to give to their biggest pumping DPS, or fished for the AoE one, which was still 5% stronger than it was before. These numbers made the job absolutely insane, especially if you time dilated somebody who just was your absolute damage pumper, and then you gave them Celestial. Like, if you just gave them all the time boosting, they could just have a 30% damage increase for like 40-something seconds. It was absolutely ridiculous. Why would you bring a White Mage that doesn't have nearly as many options as this job? It's not like it had the mitigation or the shields or anything. This had, you know, so this had Collective Unconscious. This had the regens built in. You could just go with the shields, which were buffed to heck. It could fill either slot. It definitely filled the White Mage slot more than the Scholar slot, but it was good at both. And it was just absolutely nutso what they did with these cards and how effective they made them. That it was just, you couldn't avoid it being a staple at that point. Its other abilities here were nothing to, you know, nothing really changed, and there was still nothing really exciting here. But man, by the end of Heavensward, Astra was an absolute force to be reckoned with. There were so many healers that swapped over to it that it was the most commonly played healer, I think, across everything. At least amongst endgame raiders, it was among the most commonly played jobs. But, you know, times change, and we had a new expansion to go into, Stormblood. So how did the job fare then? Not gonna lie, I need to see the abilities to remember, because I just remember Astra being good for a while. And I think Stormblood's going to continue that trend and improve a few things. All right, now off of the console games wiki and on to the official Final Fantasy XIV job guides that we got in Stormblood. This one is dated to June 23rd, 2017. This would have made it right before the new expansion release. This would have been early access day, I think, because Heavensward released on June 23rd, but early access was the 20th. I think this one was early access 23rd and launch was the 26th or 27th or something like that. Either way, what I love about this page is that it gives us what actually changed going into 4.0. And for a lot of these first few skills, you can see nothing, 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 nothing. Even light speed, you know, nothing, 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 nothing. Diurnal, instead of getting the attack speed increase, instead, it got the healing magic potency by 10%. The same thing that Nocturnal Sect had in the previous one. They got Undraw as well, which I think you all know is laughable to this point. And then we had a bunch of changes to Aspected Benefic. Its cure potency was made a flat 200. Nocturnal Sect didn't get its own potency, but Nocturnal Sect was changed from the 130% HP barrier, which is strange because I could have swore it's at 170% on the thing that we just looked at, but whatever, we'll take it. We'll take the 130 here, to 250% of the HP restored. So yeah, it got a pretty significant boost up. And again, that was welcome. Though, again, I remember MP cost being a problem. And as you can see here, MP cost has been increased. I know this didn't survive very long into the expansion because MP problems were rampant at the start of Stormblood. Royal Road unchanged. Spread can no longer be canceled to initiate the cooldown timer. Just a little functional change there. Combust 2 was made instant, and its potency was increased from 45 to 50, and it had its MP cost reduced. Was this the point where it was a trait? Yeah, I think at this point Combust 2 is a trait off of Combust 1, and they were no longer separate. So I think that's the reason. It's now matching Combust 1. Nocturnal Sect had its old effect increased from 10% to 15%. So they just gave Diurnal the 10% and then bumped this one up even further. So those shields getting strong. Sinistry had the effective spell-based HP restoration being increased by 20% removed. Wasn't a fan of that, but they made so many changes in the other spots that it ended up not really mattering that much. But again, Sinistry became kind of a joke. It was never really a loved skill other than that 20% buff it had during Heavensward towards the later parts. And this didn't help because there just wasn't enough case uses for it. Malefic 2 had its potency reduced and its MP cost reduced. You had a collective unconscious. Rotating your character will now also cancel the effects. So again, another functional change to it, but not actually anything new. You have Earthly Star. I mean, you know how it works now, and it worked pretty much the same. You had to make sure that you waited the 10 seconds to get Earthly Dominance, and bam. You know a skill has just worked and has been loved when it's gone almost completely unchanged in all the years. This was 2017. It's been 6 years, and this skill, other than the potencies changing, still largely works the same. Stellar Detonation, pretty much the same thing here. You have Malefic 3, which, you know, just an evolution off Malefic 2. The reason why Malefic 2 was brought down in the first place. And then we had the Minor Arcana. The first iteration of it converts the currently drawn Arcanum into either a Lord of Crowns or a Lady of Crowns. And I think you all know what that's going to be like. Sleeve Draw as well executes Draw, Royal Road, Spread, and Minor Arcana in succession. So essentially you go from having nothing to having everything, and you need to figure out if that everything is actually everything you want. If not, you have to get through it and spend it ASAP once every 2 minutes. Things that were gone: Disable, Sadness, Stella, not surprising, Exalted Detriment, roll actions, and Luminiferous Ether, roll actions as well. That's going to be the Shroud of Saints, or I think at this point it might have just had the standard name. Going into the cards, 20% attack speed, ability recast timer, MP, own MP or the MP of the targeted party member, same with the Spire. And we had the Lord and Lady of Crowns, which were single target back then. This was a 300 potency nuke, and this was a 500 potency heal. Now, of course, they're AoEs, which has its own functional use, but that was what it was back then. And the Minor Arcana really wasn't something you had to care about. Essentially, you Minor Arcana into card if you had absolutely no use for it, and it wasn't going to help you in any way that you thought was reasonable, so you just had a chance to convert it at that point. So you could pull a lot more Lords and Ladies back then than you could now, but you were still usually fishing for the right decisions and not like just transforming all these cards into Lord and Ladies. You had your roll actions, you had your Cleric Stance, you had your Break, Protect, Asuna, Lucid Dreaming, that's the name I was looking for. Swift Cast, Eye for an Eye, Large East, Surecast, Rescue. I've already covered these in the retrospect plenty of times before, and Astro didn't have any sort of unique interaction with any of those. Going into the traits, you know, they had their Combust Masteries and their Malefic Masteries. The big thing was Hyper Light Speed, which would reduce the Light Speed recast by 5 seconds upon restoring critical HP with Benefic or Benefic 2. Not a very popular trait. I think that's worth saying because you were still not trying to single target heal. Like, yeah, I guess you could, but then you just, nobody cared. I can't say that nobody cared, but it's like, it definitely wasn't a desired effect. And that's how it released, and it was largely okay. You know, it wasn't like busted like the start of Heavensward, but again, I do remember some MP-related issues and some aspects of it that were not all the way popular, but at least the core functioning card system plus the Minor Arcanas were there. By the time we got to the end of Stormblood, I don't really remember what changed, in all honesty. I didn't really follow this job that closely in Stormblood, but looking on the surface, it doesn't seem to have changed all that much other than probably the MP cost. The big thing was that Lightspeed finally had that damage reduction taken off, so it could be used while you were DPSing. I think this change was made relatively early in the expansion, so this wasn't something people waited very long for, but it did finally happen at some point during Stormblood. Regular Helios, Essential Dignity, Benefic 2, still same potency there, Draw, Diurnal. I don't know why these images are broken. It's an old site, so, you know, I guess that's not too surprising. I also just realized you can't see my mouse cursor. Let me do that, and now you should be able to see it. Well, I mean, you should be able to see it, except that by doing that, for some reason, it broke the whole thing. There we go. Technical difficulties. I love it. Listen, that's what happens when you dive however many years into the past. You got to take the technical difficulties with it. Aspected Benefic, still largely the same. Royal Road, still largely the same. Empty Road, I completely forgot they added this. Cancel the Stored Royal Road effect. I don't know anyone who used that. Spread, still largely the same. Undraw spread. Oh, the undraws. Oh my god. I forgot, dude. Just bloating over and over again. Ugh. Aspected Helios, largely the same. I'm sure it had some MP cost changes. Redraw, Combust 2, Nocturnal Sect was the 15%. Sinistry, still largely the same. Gravity. Oh, and just in case you're wondering on the date, this was January 8th, 2019. So just a handful of months before Shadowbringers had come out. Gravity's still the same. Malefic 2, 180 still. That was its reduced amount. Time Dilation, Collective Unconscious, Celestial Opposition. I mean, pretty much all these remain the same. I'm sure there are other changes present somewhere here, but if there are very, very few of them. Ah, here they are. They brought the balance back down to 10% because that was too powerful. Took them a way too long of a time to do that, but it definitely needed to happen way back when. They also at some point changed the spear. I remember this being relatively early on, and it was changed to a crit rate buff, which was actually fairly appreciated. So if you didn't pull the balance and instead pulled a spear, people were okay with it. You know, crit hit rate was always gonna be a good thing unless you were someone who had guaranteed crits, because we didn't have the whole, you know, if it's a guaranteed crit, you get potency instead thing. Like we do nowadays. So, you know, but it was still okay. Getting added crit rate's never a bad thing. I don't think anyone would complain. Then you had the Ewer and the Spire, which were largely the same, and the Lord and the Lady, which were largely the same. Going into the role actions, again, these were largely the same as well. There's not really much to say. And for traits, Hyper Light Speed, instead was changed to reduce the recast time by 10 seconds upon executing Essential Dignity. You can tell that the feedback that it being Benefic 1 and Benefic 2 reached the developers because absolutely nobody cared about the original one, and this one was more reasonable because you knew how frequently you were going to get Essential Dignity. So you could actually plan around light speed increasing, and you could make sure you had it for key moments. So it was definitely a far more welcome change. But that is Astrologian for Stormblood. I think it survived fairly well. It was definitely as popular, but I don't remember if White Mage was really still being played as much. I remember White Mage really making its comeback going into Shadowbringers, and Astro still just kind of being dominant. I mean, Astro Scholar. I remember seeing, actually, that's not true. I remember seeing a decent amount more White Mage Astro, because the Nocturnal Ast was considered very, very strong at the end of Heavensward, but really more so in Stormblood once White Mage had a few of its additional tools built in. So I do remember seeing that a little bit more, and heck, pretty much all the solo heals that you were seeing coming out for endgame rating came from a Nocturnal Astro because the job was just way too strong. So that's it for Stormblood Astro. Then we dive into Shadowbringers, and I think that's where things get really divisive about Astro, or at least they start to. Here we go. We have June 27th, 2019, and this is, again, kind of like the early access update to the job guide for Shadowbringers, and this is where we're going to see a significant number of changes. So first, we have some of the healer-related changes overall. The cast time being reduced for Benefic to 1.5 seconds to make weaving a much easier thing for all of the healers, so that was, of course, really nice. Damage over time on Combust being brought down. Lightspeed having its effect duration increased from 10 seconds to 15 seconds. Helios having its potency bumped up by 30, and we're probably going to see a lot of potency bumps. I mean, that's just like a really normal thing for Shadowbringers. Essential Dignity getting its second stack once it got the trait. The potency of Benefic 2 going up to 700. And then we come to Draw. The requirements execute command again to use the Arcanum drawn. Only one Arcanum can be drawn at a time has been removed. Arcanum effect now must be triggered by using the action Play. That's right, you would draw into the play slot and then have to use the play slot in order to actually play again. Requirement recast timer will begin once the drawn Arcanum is read or the draw timer expires has been removed. Yeah, because now you just pressed it and bam, you had 30 seconds automatically going because the play button was a completely separate button overall. Then you have Diurnal Sect, which no longer has the bonus effect. It just had the regen. So you're still choosing between a regen healer and a shield healer, but they got rid of all of the others, like, the bonus healing and the attack speed and all the stuff they had from the previous 2 expansions. Those were both gone. It also didn't have the enmity generation thing anymore because tank stance was just a foregone conclusion at this point. This is where enmity generation and enmity management was really no longer a thing. Undraw had its recast time reduced. That wasn't the problem with it. And then there's the play button that we were just talking about before. Aspected Benefic at 34 had the regen potency bumped up massively. The base cure potency was bumped up by 60. The effect duration was decreased. And the regen itself was 200 potency, which was, significant. The requirement can only be executed while under the effect of diurnal or nocturnal sect has been added. You just couldn't use it if you weren't in a sect, but you were always in a sect. Redraw going up to 3 charges and acquired a few levels earlier, so you could attempt to redraw multiple times per card. Of course, you had to wait for the cooldown to come back every 30 seconds. You got 1 redraw. So you had sometimes where maybe you'd only use 1 redraw, and then maybe sometimes you'd have to use all the ones you had stocked up and then hope that you get some decent draws so you didn't have to mess with that number. It just gave you some options when it came to redrawing. Aspected Helios, pretty much same thing. Cure, Diurnal. Oh, yeah, and don't forget Nocturnal, still 250% with that. This one also 250% on the Aspected Helios, but look at all these changes. The potency was reduced by 100. Cure potency of 150 when under Nocturnal Sect had been removed. Diurnal Sect's potency was increased by a lot, like more than 200%. That's like 250%. The regen effect was condensed to 15 seconds, so it wasn't as spread out over a wider period of time. Nocturnal Sect, of course, had that shield potency bumped up, and you had to be in a sect in order to use it. Gravity, just 130 flat potency instead of having the degrading potency after the first target. Combust 2, still a dot. Nocturnal Sect increased the MP cost of Aspected Benefic. Now they're making you pay for that fat shield, but I don't remember if that survived the whole expansion. I feel like it didn't. Sinistry, still being Sinistry, except now its recast time was 2 minutes. I don't get it either. That's fine. Minor Arcana being gotten at level 50, down from 66, and the effect of this action has been, and I quote, completely revamped. It converts the drawn Arcanum into the Lord of Crowns when the Balance Arrow or Spear is drawn, or the Lady of Crowns when Bull, Ewer, or Spire. So you had a little bit more control over what effect that you were going to be getting, but you were basically giving up a DPS card for a DPS Arcana, or a support card for a support Arcana. Then they got Divination, and the seals came into play for the first time. Increased the damage of self and nearby party members, but the amount changed depending on the seals drawn. So, of course, this is where you started drawing the difference. I think it was Balance and Bowl was 1 arrow, and Spear was another, and Ewer and Spire were the other ones. Actually, no, it was like Balance... what was it? It was like Balance Arrow Ewer, or Balance Arrow Spire, and then like Spear Ball. I don't know. There was basically a correlation drawn between the bunch. It'll say in the rest of the job guide below. But essentially, you wanted to try to pull those 3 different seals and play that mini game once every 3 minutes to make sure you got that maximum 6% damage increase whenever Divination came around. Sorry, I'm wiping my eyes. It's like, it's 9:45, and I'm an old man and it's past my bedtime, but I'm gonna finish this. Malefic 2 here had its potency reduced. Collective Unconscious had its cure potency reduced from 150 to 50. I forgot about that with Collective Unconscious. Yeah, this effect was completely changed. Can only be executed when a sect is active was changed. Yeah, create a Wheel of Fortune granting 10% damage reduction and applying a regen. The regen is the big thing that really took the hit on that. Celestial Opposition, completely revamped effect. No longer was the time dilation and the buff extending a thing at all. As you saw, time dilation was gone. Now, instead, it was an AoE heal that also gave everyone a regen when under Diurnal, and when under Nocturnal gave everyone a shield. It was instant cast. It was fairly useful, but definitely not a high impact skill. Just something that you made sure to remember to use and had its use applications, but definitely not that exciting of a skill. Earthly Star is Earthly Star. What else is there to say? It's great. Did they add something? Yeah, potency of Stellar Burst. They reduced some of the potencies of the damage aspect, but that's about it. Malefic 3 had its potency dropped by 10. Sleeve Draw had been completely revamped, resets the recast timer of draw, and grants 2 stacks of Sleeve Draw. So essentially, you could draw 3 times in a row. When you used your draw, you would use a Sleeve Draw. I think you had to either play the card or spread it. Reduce the recast draw to 3 seconds, consume a stack of Sleeve Draw each time the Arcanum is drawn. So you could basically just cards ultra fast and just work that in. Now that's been worked into the job just kind of as a whole with the way draw works now, but back then it was basically a once in 3 minute cooldown where you became a machine gun card slinger. Into the new skills, Combust 3 and Malefic 4, just upgrades to the basic spells. Celestial Intersection, interesting ability, essentially did the opposite of whatever sect you were in. So by default, it had a cure potency of 150 as an off-global instant. If you were in Diurnal, it would give the target a fat shield, and if you were in Nocturnal, it would give the target a regen. So it was a really interesting way to cross the two stances that you had a choice between, and I really, really liked this one. It just had great use cases regardless of which one you were in. So that was a nice new ability. Horoscope was here, pretty much the same as it is now. You know, it's a basic, you know, you lay it down and then it's upgraded whenever you use Helios or Aspected Helios. So you could just buff it up with another AoE heal. And then when it finally wore off, you know, it was either the kind of small potency or the fat potency from buffing it up with Helios. Then you had Neutral Sect, 20% healing potency, and you got the effect of both Diurnal and Nocturnal Sect. It's funny because those stances are gone now, but Neutral Sect is still as strong as ever in Endwalker. So they knew they nailed it with this, and honestly, it's kind of nutso how Astro has changed to be a, quote, pure healer now, but that it still has stuff like Neutral Sect, which is absolutely insane. It was crazy good back in Shadowbringers. It's crazy good now, and I don't think I need to say anything else about that. But as you can see, some of the popular card effects were gone. Royal Road, well, Empty Road wasn't popular, but Royal Road, Spread was gone, Undraw Spread, Time Dilation, all that stuff was gone. So what everything I was saying about Sleeve Draw, nope, that was just about drawing the card, playing the card, drawing the card, playing the card, go, go, go. Then you had, well, you had draw and you drew it into the play slot. So yeah, that was essentially an auto spread. The balance, and this is where they also changed a lot of the card effects. Everything was the balance at this point, and it was all about who you were actually playing it on. Everything was 6% damage. Balance was for melee. I'm sorry, balance, arrow, and spear were all for melee or tank, and 3% for the other roles. Solar, lunar, and celestial. And then you had the ranged cards, and that of the bowl, the ewer, and the spire. So I was right the first time when I started talking about the seals. So this was the ranged card, and then solar, lunar, and celestial seals, which you would use for divination. Also with the arcana, you could instead pull a lord or lady of crowns. Lord being the 8% buff for melees or tank, and lady being the 8% buff for range DPS or healer. I remember there being a lot of, essentially, the sooner you pulled 3 seals, the sooner you could start pulling for lords and ladies, if I recall it was, or you could take a chance if you pulled the wrong seal and try to get, and just instead of playing it and replacing a seal you didn't want to replace, you would instead arcana it. That way you could be stuck with the seals that you had. So that was essentially the use case, was trying to control your seals, but I still don't remember it being that popular for some reason. Like, there's a reason why this didn't survive in this iteration until later, and I just think it wasn't popular. The role actions we don't need to talk about much, but when it comes to the traits, I mean, I think you can already see where this one is going. They still had hyper light speed, but then they had combust, malefic, and essential dignity, giving it 2 charges. Not much to say about all that, but we do have to look at the end of Shadowbringers as well. Now, I don't really remember what changed all that much. It's also worth mentioning that what was once the trait for Benefic and Shadowbringers was worked into Benefic as a whole. And this one was, instead of it having no cast time, it was also restores critical HP. Still, you were almost never using Benefic 1, so it was as useless as ever. Then we go into these. Now, I think some of the potencies did change throughout the expansion. I think they started kind of low and then went up. But Helios is still the same, so maybe I'm misremembering that. This going up to 1100. This was 1000 in Stormblood and prior. Benefic 2, 700, draw, Diurnal Sect, adding the regen. I think MP changes happened here as well. There's play, aspected Benefic. There's a 250% shield, 3 stacks of redraw. Aspected Helios having the cure potency of 200. Now to that, change. Aspected Helios had its base cure potency brought up to 200 again. I think the shield was affected, though. Yeah, the shield went from 250% to 125%. They doubled the potency, so they figured they had to cut the shield in half. So unfortunate, but reasonable. Gravity went up a couple potency, 10 potency specifically. You had Nocturnal Sect here. Listen, cats, I'm trying to finish the video. Can you hear me rushing through it? They're both surrounding me nonstop. It's daylight saving. I'm not normally in bed at this time. I'm usually getting close to it, though. There you have the Minor Arcana again. Divination being made less punishing for having less seals. Only 4, 5, and 6% instead of 2, 4, and 6%. Then you had Collective Unconscious, which, man, wow, they really extended the description of it at the very least. Here, it has the Wheel of Fortune. It has the 10% for 18 seconds, and it has the 50 potency regen for 15 seconds. Here, it's like you have Wheel of Effect Diurnal, 100 potency for 15 seconds, so that was doubled. Then you have the Nocturnal Effect, which would grant heal over time and apply... Wait, hold on. Diurnal Sect. Reduces damage taken by 10% and applies Wheel of Fortune to self and any party members who enter. Nocturnal Sect grants healing over time and applies Wheel of Fortune, which is reduces the target damage taken. It's so much text to say that it does the same thing in both stances. I swear. No, it lasts 20 seconds here. But it's 18. Okay. Anyway, I think the heal over time is... I don't even know. It's too much text. My brain is melting at 10 p.m. Tonight. It's got more text now. That's what's different. Oh, man. Okay, Celestial Opposition. Still the AoE. I think this one did see a buff. Celestial Opposition. Oh, yeah. Went from 100 cure potency to 200, and the regen went from 60 to 100. It looks like the barrier dropped as well here from 150% to 125% as well. But no biggie. No biggie on that. Earthly Star. Sleeve draw, they gave restores maximum MP. They did this very early on, if I recall, because like I said, Astro had a lot of MP issues pretty much in the early parts of every expansion, except Endwalker, if memory serves. You cannot draw an Arcanum if you are aligned with its Seal of Arcana. This was the big thing to help with Divination, is that Sleeve draw would make it so you would always draw a card that had a seal that you needed in order to make Divination a max number of seals. If you had them all already, then it would just draw any of them. But at the very least, it was that kind of little safety net that you needed for Divination at this point. Celestial Intersection, did that get any potency changes? Really need them side by side. It looks like it did. Looks like it went from 150 to 200. Looks like the shield went down from 250 to 200 in exchange for that. And it looks like the regen effect was almost doubled. It went from 80 to 150, so just under doubled. So that was a pretty significant change for that one. Horoscope had its non-buffed potency brought up by 100. I do remember that happening as well. And Neutral Sect is Neutral Sect. These are still 6%, 6%, 6%. All this is still pretty much the same, and there's not much to say about all of this. Don't think any of this stuff changed. It did not. So we are rattling through Astro at this point, and given that we're moving on to Endwalker, I think you're largely familiar with how it is at this point. So let's just briefly look at how it was a couple years ago, and then look at the most recent edition. Come on, seriously, this page is broken. This page is only like a month and a half ago. Whatever. We get the revisions from Shadowbringers going into Endwalker. The cure potency for Benefic 1 jumping up. Yay. Sure do love that. Helios had its potency jumped up, and now the AoE spells also had a cast time, or had their cast time changed to 1.5 seconds to make weaving between GCDs even that little bit smoother. Now, Essential Dignity was made to go only up to 900 potency when the target's HP is 30% or less. So a little bit more readable, but the potency was also brought down, as it was 1100 in Shadowbringers. Benefic 2's potency up, cast time brought down again. Draw, basically Sleeve Draw is kind of worked into this in some capacity. Draws a card from your Divining deck. Only one Arcanum can be drawn at a time. Arcanum effect can be triggered using the action Play. It would restore 5% max MP and grant Clarifying Draw, which would allow for the execution of Redraw with a maximum of 2 charges. You're familiar with how Draw works now, so you should be familiar with how it looks here as well. Aspected Benefic had its... I mean, at this point, you got to remember Sect both of them were gone. So Aspected Benefic just has the regen potency, the flat cure potency, the regen potency. That's just how it works. All the nocturnal stuff is gone from all of the aspected abilities. Redraw, maximum charge is 3, can only be executed when under clarifying draw, and the recast time is only 1 second. Aspected Helios, again, cast time was changed to 1.5 seconds, but otherwise the effects were made to be more in line with the fact that it was essentially just a pure healer. Gravity had its potency bumped down, but also had its MP cost bumped down as well. Then we go into Divination, flat 6%, no need to draw seals. Instead, the seals were worked into Astrodyne, which, if you know how Astro works now, shouldn't be any surprise. The 1, 2, and 3 sign types, of course, always aiming for that 3 to get the Harmony of Mind effect for that 5% damage dealt and healing potency. The second one's good with the 10% haste, and the MP, of course, no one would ever complain about, but everyone wants that 5% damage dealt. Come on, damage, damage, damage. Everything's damage, damage, damage. Potency of Malefic 2 brought down, not a big deal. Collective Unconscious, just largely similar to the way it was before. It says completely different, but I mean, it is just the regen plus the damage reduction as it was before. What will eventually happen, I know, is that it'll pulse outward. That's a change later in Endwalker, the way we have it now, basically. Celestial Opposition, not going to lie, it's been a while since I played Astro and Endwalker. Forgot they still had this. AoE, Instant Heal, Cure Potency with a regen. You know, all the nocturnal effects gone. Earthly Star, still Earthly Star. They made the actual explosion potencies higher and made the radius bigger, but other than that, you know, not much different. This isn't the super radius, is it? No, it's bigger, but I don't think that's the super radius yet, like the one that we get later. Oh, I can't wait to read that number, but it's hilarious how big all the healer effects are now in Endwalker. You know, Malefic had its potency changed. Minor Arcana updated the effects. You know, now we know Lord of Crowns is the AoE damage ability, and Lady of Crowns is the AoE heal ability. Once a minute, you know, that's just, you just hope you pull Lords most of the time. And there's Crown play for actually playing them as well. Combust 3, potency change. Malefic 4, potency change. Celestial Intersection. Still gives you the barrier. Still restores the HP. And now has 2 charges, courtesy of Endwalker. Horoscope still largely the same. You know, still have to buff it and all that stuff. Neutral Sect, again, still largely the same healing magic potency. And then it gets the Aspected Benefic and Helios barriers, the old nocturnal effects added in. Still very, very good. You have the new spells, Malefic, Gravity 2, Exaltation, reduce target damage taken by 10%, and then after 8 seconds, restores HP. Huge fan of, again, the more time magey skills, and if their rework goes in any direction that isn't the current one, I hope they lean more into the time mage aspects of Astrologian. Then you get Macrocosmos. Macrocosmos is good. It's gone through a few changes, you know, throughout the expansion, but even still, Macrocosmos is one of my favorite healing buttons in the entire game right now. It's just so freaking good. So I don't even need to say anything else about it. And then the cards still largely the same, except now the seals are used for Astrodyne, so they're signs instead of seals. And I already mentioned the changes to Lady and Lord, so those haven't really changed at all. Going into current Endwalker, the big thing we get to look at here is, where's Earthly Star? Where's Earthly Star? Let me see the... Oh, no, it's still a 20 ohm. Maybe 20 ohms is the big radius. For some reason, I thought it was bigger than that. Although this is 30... Oh, no, yeah, it's a 20 ohm radius. Oh, yeah, no, it's big. Oh, they made everything else match Star. Yeah, Star itself was big. It was Collective Unconscious that... Well, no, Collective Unconscious pulses outward. I don't think it's the barrier that's big. But now, yeah, creates a Celestial Ring 8 yalms, but it actually pulses out, I think, 30 yalms to make sure that everybody get... Yeah, there it is. Within 30 yalms pulses the initial effect. So that's really the big thing that ended up going throughout all the changes. Other than that, I actually don't think too much else changed with Astrologian over the rest of the expansion. Most of this is still relatively the same. I think Macrocosmos underwent some small changes. And then I know all the cards are pretty much the same, except maybe their potencies changed. No, those didn't change either. Has Astro really gotten like no changes the whole expansion, other than benefiting a little bit from those changes to the radius on everything? It looks like that's the case, because I don't really see much different in, well, literally any of their cards. Maybe I feel like there was something that maybe changed with redraw or something. Maybe it doesn't really read any different though. So there you go. I guess that's the very unexciting ending to it. And now we get to wait for Dawn Trail to see what they end up doing. I know Astro players are a little nervous. You have every right to be. You probably should be a little scared, but hoping for the best. Now, before my cats actually go crazy, because again, they don't seem to realize what daylight saving is, not that cats ever do, I think we can wrap up this final retrospective video on Astrologian. So thanks again for reminding me to get this video out. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And if there's any sort of retrospective you think I haven't done, some people were asking for like Shadowbringers, the raids, and I'm like, I released videos on those like 2 years ago. I don't know that I need to re-release a retrospective on the previous expansion. Stormblood was a pretty different era. I don't know that I need to re-look back at the Shadowbringers ones, but if there's any sort of retrospective you think I haven't covered, be sure to let me know, because I think there are some. I think there was maybe like the... no, I think I did the Alliance raids. I think I did. If I didn't do the Alliance raids, I guess there's that one. I'll have to look back at all the rest of my retrospectives, but if not, it's been fun looking back over the past year. And I hope you've enjoyed looking back on all these times and remembering what you either perceive as better times for some of these jobs or significantly worse times, depending on which job it actually was. But anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next one. And until then, take care.